Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 18th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a crazy pathway to the presidency for President Biden in the 2024 presidential election. Now, for a long period of time, we have been taking a look at an electoral map largely like this one. This is my most recent election projection from the beginning of the month here that gave you a general understanding of where I believed current states were expected to go if the election was held today. And at the conclusion of it, I said that President Joe Biden, at the time of the prediction, would likely win re-election by the narrowest of margin, largely, and would tie for the second closest presidential election we have seen in modern political history, with the only other election with identical margins being in the year 2000, when George W. Bush defeated then Vice President Al Gore. This 2024 presidential election prediction is one that requires a bunch of different moving factors in favor of President Biden, in favor of President Trump, that culminates to a 271 to 267 map. It requires Biden victories in the Rust Belt, Trump victories in the Rust Belt, Biden victories in the Sun Belt, Trump victories in the Sun Belt, and in different battleground states, and less competitive but still not safe states that we would entirely expect to go to certain candidates, but that would need to be solidified and shored up in a scenario like this one. And so I couldn't help but thinking, within the realm of possibility, what would be the craziest pathway to the presidency for President Biden? And I will first preface this by saying that when I say within the realm of possibility, I mean it truly. I'm not here to try to throw a state like Wyoming or a state like Arkansas in the Democratic Party's column for the sake of finding a pathway to 270. If I wanted to do that, I would really only do it, just to be humorous, right? And so this is a video that could genuinely explore a reality, one that is potentially one of the 100 different scenarios we could see this coming November, where President Biden does, in fact, win re-election, but goes through a very unorthodox route. And I'm going to go ahead and use margins to sort of explain exactly the circumstance for something like this, the way that this would only be able to happen in a very, very, unique sort of situation. And so that's what I'm hoping to explore in a map like this one. But at the baseline, similar to the map like this, a lot of states are going to come in at safe red and safe blue, and many of them will still be equally as competitive. President Biden is going to be defending a number of safe Democratic states. We entirely expect those to go to the Democratic Party, states like Hawaii and California and Washington, D.C. On the Republican side, it would also have a number of states on their end that would be considered to be safe. States like Missouri and states like North Dakota and Montana are very solid for the Republican Party here. And so that brings us to a total roughly 125 electoral votes for President Trump, 181 for President Biden here, and we generally do work with the same 232 electoral votes. And I think that's really what makes this election so interesting, is that since the very beginning, we have known which states will be the defining ones for this election, which states will be the true most important ones this coming November, and it's always, always, always so fascinating to unpack them in an election scenario, prediction, whatever it might be, just as we are doing so right now. And so in this situation, in this weird and alternative pathway to the presidency, it would require President Biden and President Trump to win in many of the same states that they did in the last election, meaning states like New Hampshire, states like Minnesota and Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia would all need to be in the exact same characterization, and Nebraska second, as they were in the last race. On the flip side, Donald Trump would need to maintain where he is. And I could entirely imagine a state like Florida expanding. I don't think his pathway, President Biden's pathway to 270, lies in Florida. I think Texas would remain to be a state that is on the Republican side, but would need to narrow down to lean. More on that in just a moment. Maybe you can start to piece together. I would honestly say a state like Iowa and Ohio, I could actually see moving over into the safe red column. I would also say, too, honestly speaking, if a scenario like this was to actually come to fruition, it would have, President Biden probably seeing a decreased margin in New Hampshire and Minnesota and Nebraska second, but he would need to keep those states. There is no pathway to victory without them. But I think maybe you can start to figure out exactly where this pathway lies. And I think my map here honestly looked quite crazy. If I'm being honest with you, this is a map here that's not cohesive. It is a really, really jumbled map. There's no, put together set a number of states. I honestly think the 2004 presidential electoral map is probably one of the prettiest when it comes down to looking at maps here Almost every Democratic state is connected with the exception, not even the exception. I don't think a single state was disconnected from each other on the Democratic Party side. You had seen that John Kerry had won the Northeast, he had won the Rust Belt, he had won Illinois, and then a sea of red. Colorado was red, New Mexico was red, Arizona was red, Nevada was red. And so it was a lot, I would say, on the Democratic Party side. That was together. Republicans were all put together as well. Just a very overall pretty electoral map. But again, aesthetics is not what we're looking for here, and that's not what determines a map to be crazy. What determines a map to be crazy, I think, or crazier, or more outlandish, or whatever term you want to use to make this more palatable, it's crazy. This is a map that would require a huge reallocation of resources and investments and time and energy that you would see maybe a scenario like this one come to reality. So let's go ahead and take a look. The first one here we would have to take a look at is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These three states together would need a whole separate conversation because these are the ones that the Democratic campaign right now is heavily relying on for the election. But let me say this. In a scenario like this, and we're talking about, a complete change from what we're expecting, of course, it's not going to run through the Rust Belt. We are talking about a Sun Belt strategy that could bring Joe Biden to 270 by completely abdicating responsibility for his field offices, for his volunteers, for his team in these three battleground states. Trump would win Maine second easily. That's besides the point. I want to get to these battleground states because these are the ones I care about the most in a scenario like this. So what it would look like is a heavy investment into these Sun Belt states. It would require the narrowing up of states like Texas and the expansion in the leftward column of states like Colorado and New Mexico, taking Biden plus 10 states, plus 14 states, and turning them into at least Biden plus 15. That, in turn, would narrow down the state of Texas. Now, I still don't believe Florida would narrow down because I think we would loop that out of a map like this. But Texas would narrow. Colorado would become bluer. New Mexico would become bluer, which means those Democratic states from 2020, Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, would all need to become Democratic states and need to be locked down for the Biden campaign. You're talking investments and, again, completely taking out resources in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, giving it to Trump in the idea that you can make up for it elsewhere, which means the winning strategy wouldn't come through Florida, wouldn't come through Arizona, would not come through Wisconsin, wouldn't come through Michigan. It would come through Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. That would be the necessary number of states and electoral votes to bring President Biden over the finish line. At 275 to Donald Trump's, let's see what the number is here, I would expect that these states would become quite conservative, 263. This is a cursed map. This is a map that maybe, if Democrats were to adopt a strategy that they solely focused on North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, while staying at bay, losing support, but staying at bay in the other battleground states that don't exist in the Sun Belt region, in Nebraska's 2nd District, in Minnesota, in Maine at large, in New Hampshire. And what you would find is that by turning away from the Rust Belt, Ohio becomes safe red, Iowa becomes safe red, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania become likely red, and I think that wouldn't be too far out from reality if the Biden campaign was not to contest it. Minnesota would narrow down from being a Biden plus 7, 8-point state to Biden plus 1 or 2. Same thing in Nebraska 2nd, same thing in New Hampshire. All of them were 7 points or more for President Biden in the last race. In this scenario, I expect them to be no more than 1 to 2% in favor of the Democrats. And that 5-6 point shift would be enough to make a state like Wisconsin or potentially even Pennsylvania, maybe if you add an additional percentage, a likely red state. It would require significant votes turned away from Democrats in Michigan, but still, that's what a total shift in those states would be. And then when you look at the Sun Belt region, you would find that Democrats at 275 would mean North Carolina would have to flip for the first time since 2008, Georgia would have to remain blue, Arizona would have to remain blue, and so would Nevada. And the reason why I think this also is quite crazy is because it means that Colorado and New Mexico would become safe blue. Texas would narrow down to lean. And it would be an entirely different type of strategy from what the campaign Democrats right now are currently trying to employ. Because they are very, very clearly trying to go through the Rust Belt, trying to remain ahead and in the advantage point amongst that blue wall, because that is the blue wall that led them to victory in 2020 and could keep them in office in 2024. It also stands in direct contrast with a lot of the polls that we're seeing in these battleground states. Arizona has Trump up by 5. Nevada has Trump up by 5. Georgia has Trump up by 5. North Carolina has Trump up by 5. Wisconsin, 0.1. Pennsylvania, 2.3. Michigan, 0.3. 2 points or less in these 3 battleground states. And yet 5, 5, 5, 5. Sounds like AP scores. 5, 5, 5, 5 across those Sunbelt states here. Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And yet, in a scenario like this, Biden wins them. And so, while I don't think this is a strategy that I think would be particularly that advantageous for the Biden team, I think what they are trying to do is, with the correct number of resources, spend a lot of money in the Sunbelt states and building out those pathways to 270, because they exist. There could be a circumstance in which a map like this does arise, where maybe the polls are completely missing what we see in the Rust Belt and completely missing what we see in the Sun Belt, just in very different ways. Underestimating Trump in one, underestimating Biden in the other. Because we actually see that happening in some states and saw it happen in recent midterm and presidential elections. For instance, when you take a look at Georgia's polls from 2020, we saw that Donald Trump was slated to win based on the most recent election polls, that we would see Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue winning in those Senate races. In the state of Nevada, we also saw that Joe Biden was losing to Donald Trump on election day. What happened? Democrats outperformed those polls by roughly 3 points. Get this, so did Hillary Clinton. But you know which states saw underperformances for President Biden? Wisconsin, Biden was supposed to win by 8. He won by 1. In Michigan, Biden was supposed to win by 4. He won by 3. And in Pennsylvania, Biden was supposed to win by 4 or 5 points, and he won by 1. My point and takeaway here is that it actually isn't too far-fetched that a reality like this one could be our outcome this election. I think North Carolina would be the largest and most substantial flip of this election season if that was to happen. Not Wisconsin going back red, not Michigan going back red, not Pennsylvania going back red, but rather North Carolina going blue. That would be a really big deal for Democrats. It would be what lands them the presidency. I mean, without those 16 electoral votes, you can see here that Joe Biden or Donald Trump, neither of them, are at 270 electoral votes. And so I think Democrats also, too, realize that North Carolina could be part of a sneaky pathway to victory, as Republicans largely ignore the state, neglect it when it comes down to advertisement spending, and are having abysmal candidates run for state superintendent, for governor, in congressional races. Democrats lucked out in North Carolina in the sense that Republicans aren't taking it seriously. Unlike a number of battleground states here, including some of the ones we have in the Biden campaign right now, like Georgia, like Arizona, Republicans haven't invested any money in North Carolina. They aren't vetting their candidates here. They aren't making major investments in field offices. I mean, all around, it's not a tremendously good look, considering, which political party this is. Because North Carolina, even though Democrats haven't been able to win it, is still absolutely competitive, and Democrats are outflanking Republicans in a number of metrics, including field offices, including statewide resources, including statewide hiring. I mean, a number of different things sort of point out and tell us that Republicans actually do not have it all together in the way that the polls might suggest. They don't have everything well-versed and, a well-oiled machine ready to win this election, because otherwise, they would be on the ground in these states. They would be matching the Democrats in these states. And so maybe, just maybe, in a very outlandish scenario, we actually could see a map like this one arise, where the support in the Rust Belt dips and is picked up in the Sun Belt. While I don't think a map like this is going to be our reality by any metric, I do think that we shouldn't entirely write it off, or at least some combination of something like this happening, where a state like North Carolina, for instance, might not vote for President Biden and might vote for Donald Trump, but a state like Michigan goes to Joe Biden and North Carolina doesn't. And with Georgia and Arizona, given the population shifts and given where we are nationally, those states, combined with Michigan, could carry President Biden over the finish line. He loses Michigan but wins Pennsylvania. His margin actually expands, 278 to 260. My takeaway here, I think, is that there are multiple ways that we could see President Biden win re-election. And while this may be the craziest map to me right now, based on what we've seen in the polls, based on just general trend lines that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania usually vote in unison altogether, honestly speaking, it is very, very rare that we see states like this split. And the last time we saw a split actually nearly identical to this one was in 1988 with George H.W. Bush. And so these three blue wall states that turned into the red wall in 2016 back to being the blue wall are, largely states that vote together and are swung together. So I think that also makes sense in a map like this one. But this is it. 275 for President Biden, 263 for Donald Trump. And I think it really goes to show, too, if the Sun Belt is approached and treated with a high level of enthusiasm, enough to a point where Democrats are removing themselves from a competitive state like Michigan, like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania. An investment like this might eventually pay off. It's a huge gamble, and I don't think that it's something that Democrats should do. But I equally think it shows that there are multiple pathways to the presidency for President Biden, and arguably in some cases for President Trump, but more so for President Biden, given his 2020 electoral map. And this really highlights one that may be probably the least likely that we've seen on our overall map spread, but still something that we should give some thought to, because it isn't too far out from what we are seeing right now. And so I think just keeping our eyes on Sunbelt states, keeping our eyes on national and statewide trends, because they can reveal a lot about an election. And I think a map like this one might show us that maybe something will start to change on the Biden side. If they start to see their numbers slip in the Rust Belt, if they start to see national numbers fade in different regions of the country, they know where they can focus, because the math is clear. Biden can win in the Sun Belt, even if it makes no sense. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.